What would you do if capture meant humiliation, torture, and the loss of everything you stood for? Would you lay down your weapon, beg for mercy, and live with shame? Or would you choose death, no matter how painful, if it meant protecting your honor? This was the choice faced by Japan's samurai in the late 16th century. For them, surrender was worse than death. To fall into enemy hands meant not just the end of life, but the end of honor. And in the age of the samurai, honor was everything. The year was 1582. The mighty warlord Oda Nobunaga had been betrayed and defeated. His castle burned, his dream of uniting Japan was shattered. Across the land, his loyal warriors were hunted down, cornered, and given a choice: surrender or die. Among them was a samurai named Tori Mototada. Tori knew the rules of the world he lived in. He knew that if captured, he would be paraded like an animal through enemy streets. He knew he would be mocked, beaten, and tortured until nothing of him was left. He knew his name would be cursed, his family shamed forever. So when the enemy closed in, he made a decision. He would not be taken alive. Most samurai chose seppuku, the ritual act of cutting open the belly. It was slow, bloody, and agonizing, but it was seen as the honorable path. It showed that even in death a warrior had control over his fate. But some went even further. Some were said to do the unthinkable, to take the sword meant for battle, place it against their lips, and drive it into their mouths. Imagine that moment. The battlefield is silent except for the crackle of flames. Smoke rises into the night sky. The enemy waits, eager to take him prisoner, and then he grips his blade, not by the handle, but by the edge. His teeth close on the steel. The taste of iron floods his tongue. Blood spills instantly, and yet he pushes harder, swallowing shards of the very weapon he once used to fight. To his comrades, it was the ultimate act of loyalty, proof that a samurai would rather shred his own body than hand victory to the enemy. To those who watched, it was a nightmare, the kind of death that left men shaken, unsure if they had just seen courage or madness. And to us, centuries later, it is one of the most haunting images from Japan's age of war. A soldier so loyal that even his death had to be a weapon, a man who chose steel over surrender. So ask yourself again, if you were Tori Mototada, standing on the edge of defeat, with enemies waiting to drag you through the mud, what would you choose? Japan in 1582 was a land of fire and swords. For over 100 years, warlords had fought for power. Villages burned, farmers were dragged into battles. The country was broken, carved into pieces by men who wanted to rule it all. Out of this chaos rose a man feared and admired in equal measure: Oda Nobunaga. He was not like other lords. Nobunaga used new weapons, new ideas, and he demanded loyalty at any cost. Where other generals relied on bows and spears, Nobunaga brought guns to the battlefield. He moved fast, struck hard, and crushed anyone who stood in his way. He dreamed of uniting all of Japan under one banner, his banner. For a time it looked as though nothing could stop him. He destroyed old clans that had ruled for centuries. He broke the power of Buddhist warrior monks who had defied lords before him. He scared men who thought themselves untouchable. His name spread like thunder across Japan, but power in that time was fragile. A friend could become an enemy in a single night. And that night came, in June 1582. Nobunaga had stopped at Honogyoto. He was far from his main army, guarded by only a few hundred men. It should have been safe, but while he rested, one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned traitor. His soldiers surrounded the temple, blocking every way out. Then they set the wooden halls on fire. The flames rose quickly, smoke filled the rooms, arrows rained down from outside. Nobunaga's guards fought, but they were too few. Inside, Nobunaga knew the truth. He was trapped. If captured, he would be dragged through the streets, mocked by those who once feared him. His enemies would gloat over his humiliation. His dream of ruling Japan would die in shame. So Nobunaga made a final choice. He would not be taken alive. As fire roared around him, he performed seppuku, the ritual suicide of a samurai. He died by his own hand, not his enemies. When the news spread, it was like lightning splitting the sky. Nobunaga, the man who had seemed unstoppable, was gone. Armies that had followed him broke apart. Fortresses that had flown his banner stood exposed. Enemies who had hidden in fear now raised their heads, eager to strike. Among the men left in the wreckage was one of Nobunaga's loyal retainers. Tori Mototada. Mototada was a man who had built his life on duty. His loyalty was not only to Nobunaga but to the ideal of the samurai. And now, with Nobunaga dead, Mototada's world was crumbling. Imagine his position. The ground itself seemed to shake with betrayal. Enemies were closing in, allies turned silent. Around him some men fled into the forests, stripping off their armor, hoping to live as peasants. Others whispered of surrender, praying their lives might be spared. But Mototada stood still. He had no thought of begging, no thought of running. He believed there was only one way left, to meet his end with honor. The castle he guarded trembled with the sound of marching armies. Outside, enemy banners filled the horizon, their colors sharp against the smoke-filled sky. The beat of war drums echoed like thunder. Inside, the samurai prepared for death. Some prayed softly, their lips moving in silence. Some polished their blades one last time, hands shaking. Mototada walked among them. His armor was dented from earlier fights, his sword marked by use. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet fire. He knew that capture meant disgrace. A captured samurai could be mocked, tortured, or paraded like an animal. That was worse than any wound. This was the heart of the code of Bushido. Honor above life, courage above fear, loyalty above all. To die with honor was to live forever. To survive in shame was to be forgotten. Mototada gathered his men. His voice was steady. Do not fear death. Fear only disgrace. We are samurai. We will not kneel. If we fall as warriors. The men listened. Fear still clung to their faces, but his words gave them strength. They knew what must be done. Then the enemy came. Arrows hissed through the air, stones smashed against the gates. Fire licked the wooden walls. The castle roared with the sound of battle. Inside, Tori Mototada prepared himself. He had seen what his lord had done at Honoiji. Nobunaga had chosen death over shame. Mototada would do the same. But he also knew of darker whispers. Some samurai, when all hope was gone, did not only cut their bellies. Some took their own blades into their mouths, biting down, swallowing steel, destroying themselves so completely that nothing was left for the enemy to mock. That thought, terrible and heavy, lingered in the air. The men around him felt it too. Death was coming, but how they died, that was still in their hands. History remembers Mototada not for begging, not for fleeing, but for the decision he would soon make. A decision so shocking, so extreme, that it has echoed across the centuries. The fall of Oda Nobunaga did not just end a man's dream. It created a moment in which one samurai would show the world just how far honor could go. The world of the samurai was built on one word: honor. For a samurai, life without honor was no life at all. To surrender in battle, to be dragged before an enemy in chains, to beg for mercy. This was worse than death. A samurai's body could be broken, but his spirit was not supposed to bow. His name, his reputation, his loyalty, these were more important than his breath. This belief was captured in the code they lived by: Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was not written in one book or taught in one school. It was passed through actions, through stories, through the examples of those who came before. Bushido demanded loyalty to one's lord, courage in the face of danger, and a death that would bring no shame. And so, when defeat came, there was one path left: seppuku seppu. Seppuku was not an ordinary suicide. It was a ritual, a performance of loyalty. The samurai would kneel, his sword or dagger before him. He would open his robes, expose his stomach, and cut deep across it. It was agony, but it showed control, defiance, and honor in the face of death. Often another samurai would stand ready to end his suffering with a final strike to the neck, giving him a swift release. For the samurai, this was a way to turn defeat into victory. It robbed the enemy of the joy of capture. It gave the dying warrior the final word to take. But not every death was so clean. The battlefield was a place of chaos. Fires burned, arrows rained, soldiers screamed. Sometimes a warrior had no time for ritual. Sometimes capture came too quickly. And in those desperate moments, darker stories were told. Stories of men who forced their faces into their own swords, biting the steel until their mouths were torn apart. Stories of warriors who tried to swallow the blade, letting it cut their throats from the inside. These were acts born not from calm ceremony, but from raw terror, and unshakable loyalty. To us, it sounds like madness. To them, it was proof. Proof that they would rather destroy themselves than let their enemies boast of capturing them. Why such extremes? The answer lies in what capture meant in that age. An enemy who caught a samurai alive did not treat him with kindness. Prisoners were not honored. They were tools, trophies, playthings for the victor. A captured samurai might be paraded through the streets in chains while peasants laughed and spat on him. He might be beaten, mocked, forced to crawl like a dog. Torture was not uncommon. Burning, cutting, slow methods designed to break not only the body, but the pride. And in the end, his death would come anyway, but with shame. No samurai could accept such an end. So the choice was simple, though terrible. Take death into your own hands, or let your enemy use your life as a spectacle. For most, there was no choice at all. Death was freedom. Death was loyalty. Orimototada understood this truth. He had lived his life in service, and he knew what was expected when the walls closed in. Capture was never an option. His honor, and the honor of his lord, demanded a clean end. Yet the stories of warriors who took the blade into their mouths whispered through his mind. These were not tales told with pride. They were told in hushed tones, as warnings, as dark reminders of what men could do when pressed to the edge. Still, the fact that such stories survived says much about the age of the samurai. Men believed them because they fit the spirit of the time. They showed the extremes of devotion, the lengths to which warriors would go to protect their dignity. The enemy knew this too. To capture a samurai alive was a triumph. To watch him kill himself in such a way was both a frustration and a chilling sight. Imagine standing across from a man who would rather rip himself apart than kneel to you. It must have shaken even hardened soldiers. It must have planted doubt. If this is what one man will do to himself, what will his brothers do to us? Bushido was not only about loyalty to one's lord, it was also about the image of the samurai in the world. How you died mattered. Death could inspire allies, frighten enemies, and leave behind a name that endured. A coward's death was forgotten, an honorable death was remembered. A horrifying death, like biting into steel, became legend. This was the world Torii Mototada stood in. His lord, Oda Nobunaga, had chosen seppuku at Honnoji. The example was set, the code was clear. Death was the path. But the question remained, how would he take the blade to his belly, following the ritual of centuries, or would he go further, crossing the line between honor and horror? To us, it seems strange to weigh such options. To a samurai, it was everything. The way you ended your life was your final story, the last line of your name. That moment would define how people spoke of you for generations. For Mototada, the thought of capture was unbearable. He had lived by the sword, he had served a great lord. He had sworn loyalty until death. To end in chains, to end in shame, that was no end at all. His death had to speak louder than his enemy's victory. So, as the drums beat outside his walls and the sky filled with smoke, Mototada carried that weight. Around him men whispered prayers, polished blades, and waited for the storm. Each of them knew what capture meant. Each of them knew what was expected, and each of them felt the terror of what might come. The horror of capture hung heavier than the sound of swords. It was a shadow that touched every man who carried the name samurai. And in that shadow, some chose the ritual of seppuku, others chose the steel in the mouth. Both were born from the same truth, that a warrior's honor was worth more than his life. And soon, Torii Mototada would have to decide how his own story would end. The night was heavy with smoke. Flames licked the walls in the distance. The sound of drums rolled across the earth like thunder. Every man inside the castle knew the truth. The enemy was coming, and there were too many to stop. Torii Mototada stood in the center of it all, calm in a storm of fear. His armor was scratched, his sword stained from earlier battles. His face showed no panic, only a quiet weight. He had already made his decision. For days, his men had begged him to flee. They told him to hide in the mountains, to cast off his armor and live as a farmer. Others whispered that surrender might save their lives. The enemy was strong, they said. Maybe mercy would be shown. But Mototada only shook his head. He had sworn his loyalty to Oda Nobunaga. That vow had not ended with his lord's death. To run now would stain not only his own name but the honor of every man who fought beside him. To surrender would mean chains, humiliation, torture. To him it was clear. A samurai must not be taken alive. He gathered his men in the courtyard. The firelight danced on their faces. Some were young, barely more than boys, their hands shaking as they gripped their swords. Others were seasoned fighters, their eyes tired but steady. Mototada looked at each of them and spoke with a voice that carried through the smoke. "We are samurai. We are bound to our honor. The enemy waits outside, but they cannot take from us what we hold inside. If we must die tonight, we die as warriors. Do not fear death, fear only disgrace." His words settled into them like steel. Some wept, some bowed their heads, but all understood. There would be no surrender. When the meeting ended, the men prepared themselves. Some polished their blades one last time, some wrote short poems, as was tradition, to mark their final thoughts before death. Others sat in silence, staring at the flames, waiting for the moment to come. Mototada walked alone to the inner chambers. He thought of his lord, Nobunaga, who had chosen seppuku rather than capture. He thought of the stories whispered of men who had gone even further, those who had taken the blade into their mouths, biting down, swallowing steel, choosing a death so terrible that even their enemies recoiled. He wondered which end would be his. He knelt in the silence, placing his sword before him. He touched the hilt, the same weapon that had served him through so many battles. It had taken lives, defended castles, and carried his honor. Now it would take him too. The sounds outside grew louder. Arrows striking the walls, soldiers shouting, the crash of wood splintering. The enemy was almost inside. He had little time left. He closed his eyes and breathed slowly. The fear was there. How could it not be? But beneath it was resolved. This was not about escape. This was about choice. His life would not end in chains. His enemies would not laugh over his broken body. He would decide how his story was told. A soldier burst into the room, his face pale. "They've breached the outer wall, my lord. It will not be long." Mototada nodded. "Then it is time." The soldier bowed deeply, tears running down his cheeks, before leaving alone again. Mototada touched the blade. He thought of his family, of the dream of a unified Japan, of the vow that had carried him here. He felt the weight of Bushido pressing on him, like a hand on his shoulder. He whispered softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Better to die a warrior than live as a slave." The castle groaned with the sound of fire and war. Mototada lifted his sword. The decision was made. History would remember him not for fleeing, not for surrender, but for this moment, the moment a samurai chose death over capture, honor over life. Tori Mototada knew there was no escape. His lord was gone, his men were defeated, the enemy would soon reach him. He had to make a choice. A samurai could not accept capture. To be taken alive was to be humiliated, mocked, tortured, and shown to the world as a prize. That was worse than death. The code of Bushido taught that it was better to die with honor than to live with shame. Mototada understood this. He had lived his life by it. The usual way was seppuku. A samurai would cut open his stomach to prove his courage and loyalty, but seppuku required time, preparation, and a second man to deliver the final blow. Mototada did not have that. He was alone. He needed an end that left nothing for his enemies to claim. There were old stories about desperate warriors. Some said that when capture was certain, they had taken their own swords into their mouths. They bit the steel, cutting themselves from the inside. It was not a ritual death. It was not clean, but it was final. Mototada placed his sword before him. He held it steady in his hands. He bowed his head slightly, as if acknowledging that this would be his last act. Then he lifted the blade. The steel touched his lips. He tasted the metal. He pressed his teeth against the edge. His mouth filled with the taste of iron. He bit down. The pain was sharp and immediate. Blood poured across his tongue. His teeth split against the steel. His jaw tore open. He forced the blade further. His throat burned as it cut deeper. His body shook, but his grip did not loosen. There were voices nearby. The enemy was close. He knew they would come at any moment, but he gave them nothing. He did not run. He did not cry out. He did not beg. He stayed with the sword. His body weakened. His breaths grew shorter, Blood spilled down his chin and onto his armor. His arms trembled, but he held on until he had no strength left. When the enemy entered, they did not find a prisoner. They found a man who had already chosen his own death. His body leaned forward, his mouth torn, his hands still on the blade. The soldiers stopped. They had expected to seize him, to drag him away in chains. Instead, they were faced with something they did not understand. A man who had destroyed himself rather than be touched by them. Torii Mototada was gone, but his act remained. To his enemies it was a disturbing sight they would never forget. To his followers it was proof of loyalty beyond measure. To history, it became one of the most extreme examples of the samurai's refusal to be captured alive. Mototada did not give them his life. He did not give them his shame. He gave himself to the sword. When Torii Mototada chose to die by his own hand, he left behind more than a body. He left a statement. It was a choice that told the world, a samurai's honor cannot be taken. His death was not quiet. It was not the controlled seppuku that others had performed for centuries. It was violent, raw, and hard to watch. Even his enemies, hardened men who had killed many times, paused when they saw it. They had expected to capture him alive, to drag him in chains, to parade him as proof of their victory. Instead, they found a man who had already destroyed himself rather than give them that chance. The soldiers who entered the room did not shout in triumph. They looked at each other in silence. Some turned their heads away. The scene unsettled them. They had seen men die in battle. They had seen seppuku. But they had not seen this. This was not only death. It was resistance in its final form. News of Mototada's end spread quickly. To his enemies it was a reminder of how far loyalty could go. To his own people it became a story told with both pride and sorrow. Pride that he had not broken, sorrow that his life had ended in such a brutal way. In time, the story grew into legend. Some said he cut his belly in seppuku, others said he put the blade in his mouth. The details shifted depending on who told it, but the meaning stayed the same. Motota refused capture, he chose death on his own terms. For samurai who heard the story, it was an example of the code of Bushido taken to its furthest edge. Bushido taught that a warrior must be loyal even unto death. Mototada's act showed that death itself could be twisted into a weapon, a final strike against the enemy. For ordinary people, the story carried another weight. It showed them what it meant to live under the shadow of warlords and their battles. A man's life could be consumed by loyalty. His death could be remembered, but his pain was his own. Some admired it, others feared it. History rarely speaks of the men who begged or surrendered. Their names vanish. But men like Mototada are remembered, because they chose endings that could not be ignored. His death was not beautiful, it was not peaceful, but it was unforgettable. That is why, centuries later, we still speak of it, because it forces us to ask questions. What does loyalty truly mean? How far should a person go for honor? Where is the line between courage and madness? For the samurai, the answer was clear. To live without honor was worse than dying in agony. To be mocked in chains was worse than spilling your own blood. Mototada accepted this, and his choice showed it. The legacy of his death is not found in castles or banners. It is found in the memory of that single act. A man alone with his sword, refusing to let his enemies take him. When we look back, we may judge it as brutal, even senseless. But in his time, in his world, it made perfect sense. It was the final proof of what it meant to be a samurai. Torii Mototada's name did not vanish into the dust of defeat. It lived on because of how he died. His body was destroyed, but his honor remained untouched. And in the end, that was all he had left to give.